oversee how the death penalty is handed out are unconstitutional. And this had a cataclysmic effect, a huge effect on the national policy landscape. It was a time where, the Supreme Court had been handing out a lot of big decisions that are now just so well known that they're almost part of our culture, like Miranda rights, right? This is an artifact of the same era. There was this idea that the Supreme Court was creating more and more protections for people who had committed crimes and were in prison. And this really angered a lot of Americans, and it caused a really big backlash. Immediately after this 1972 decision, the Supreme Court says to Americans, you can't have the death penalty as it's practiced now, but if you rewrite your laws, you can have it again. And a bunch of states say, including Texas, including Pennsylvania, many other states around the country say, you know what, we do want to have the death penalty. And we're going to rewrite our laws and we're going to bring it back into motion. And from the 1970s through the 1980s and the 90s, you see a huge sort of spike in the death penalty and in executions carried out by the states in courtrooms around the country. They're handing out more and more death sentences to people. Death rows grow from 10 people to 100 people to 500 people in some bigger states. And then you reach a kind of high watermark around the year 2000, where there's almost 50 executions in Texas. There's almost 100 around the country. And ever since the year 2000, we've been seeing a decline. And it's gotten to the point today where year by year, there's fewer than 20 executions in a year. And the number of new people who are sent to death row, right, who commit murder and then end up getting a death sentence as a result of that crime has really dwindled. Texas handed out fewer than 5 death sentences last year. That's down from many dozens, 20 years ago. So we've seen this big shift. And I, as a journalist, had, for many years been covering individual cases, learning about the issues involved, sort of writing kind of profile stories about prosecutors, about people on death row, about the problems that often come up in these cases, like inadequate defense lawyering or forensic science that isn't very scientific. So I understood the issues, but through my work at the Marshall Project, I came to see that you could sort of zoom out and not just write about one individual case, but look at sort of systemic reasons. Why did Americans embrace the death penalty so much over those, late last years of the 20th century, and why have we been rejecting the death penalty over the last 20 years? Like, what are the big systemic forces, and are there lessons in all of that for the wider criminal justice system, for public policy making more generally? And I was really kind of surprised as I went through the research just how much has changed, not only in terms of the legal system, but almost culturally. And so I'm going to just tell 2 quick stories that kind of illustrate that. And can kind of get at these big picture reasons. They both feature a woman who's sort of a main character in the book. She's a defense lawyer who lives in Houston, Texas, and her name is Danalynn Recer. And so I sat down and I spent many days sort of doing these kind of marathon interviews with her, 7-8 hours a day. I remember actually one time my mother came with me to Houston and went to the zoo and hung out in coffee shops while I did this interview. And I remember texting my mother saying, like, it's still going on. Like, this interview is lasting, 6-7 hours. I'm going to have to stay in this. And one of the stories that Danalynn, this lawyer, told me was that when she was first working as a lawyer in 1993, she was working at an office in Austin that was defending people on death row. And these were people who were facing an execution date. So the state of Texas said, on such and such date, this person's going to be executed. And this group of lawyers would swoop in and say, okay, what are the issues in the case? We want to make sure this man has the best defense possible before the state seeks to execute him. We think everybody deserves at least a good defense, right? Whether or not they deserve that ultimate punishment in the end. And we want every issue to be litigated. We want, to just feel like this execution is based on, a reliable court process. And Danalynn was at this point, she was actually a law student. She hadn't gotten her bar card yet, and she was volunteering for this office. And one of the lawyers said, we're a few days away from this one execution taking place. The man's name is Eddie Ellis. And we got a tip that a woman in Houston has some information that might help his defense. And this is again, days before the execution. So Danalynn gets on a flight. She goes to Houston. She's living in Austin, flies the half hour to get there, and meets another investigator at this apartment complex in a very sort of poor and kind of, frankly, scary part of Houston. The fellow investigator told me that Danalynn sort of didn't seem fazed walking into this environment, but they meet this old woman, and the woman says, I've been living with this secret for many years. Eddie Ellis was a maintenance man at the same apartment complex, and he was friends with my husband, and they both worked here together. And my husband once told me that he had committed murder. He had killed an old woman who lived in the apartment complex, but he had let Eddie sort of go down for the crime and get blamed for it and get the death penalty. My husband then died, and I just can't live with this guilt anymore. I can't imagine, I can't fathom that I'm going to play some role in an innocent man being executed. So Danalynn says, well, I believe you, but is there any way that we can prove that? And the woman says, well, he, I think, wrote me a letter one time and admitted to it, but I don't know exactly where it is. So we're going to have to look through my things. And they drive over to an old storage unit. They're digging through papers. The husband who had admitted to the crime in the past had died of cancer. And there were all of these sort of medical bills and hospital records. In a kind of mildewy old storage unit, right? I mean, really, one of the challenges from this book was that I wanted to find these historical anecdotes and really kind of bring them to life. So I remember her describing the mildew in the storage unit, and they find this sheet of paper, and it basically is what was promised. It says, I killed that woman many years ago, and I let Eddie Ellis go down for it, and I never told anyone, but I, just feel like I want to kind of unburden myself. And this is something, it's been a kind of deathbed confession by this man. And so Danalynn, the lawyer, has the sheet of paper, and the way she described it to me was like, I expected the clouds were going to open up and Barbra Streisand was going to start singing, and like, it's all clear skies forever. We have saved an innocent man from execution. So she races back to Austin. They scan this in and they file an appeal in his case in a court to say, Eddie Ellis, we have this new evidence that Eddie Ellis is completely innocent. They were not arguing to, in that moment to throw out his death sentence and to take him off of death row. They were just saying, we want to stop this execution so we can bring this claim to court in a more robust way. Maybe we can bring this old woman into court and have her testify and give him a hearing. Let's just stop the execution so this can get sorted out. And the prosecutors working for the state of Texas and for the city of Houston come back and say, we don't believe this this old sheet of notebook paper. We think this is all made up. You just sent some law student out to Houston and concocted this whole scheme. And, we don't think this is a reason to stop the execution. And the judges believe the prosecutors. They side with the prosecutors and they say, yeah, you know what? These defense lawyers, they have this tendency to come up at the last minute with these claims in court that are just so outlandish to try to stop executions, and it's throwing a wrench in the wheels of justice. And this has all been, adjudicated already. This man has been found guilty by a jury. He's been through years and years of appeals. Of course, they won't admit that those appeals were handled by incompetent lawyers, but they're saying, this execution should happen. And Eddie Ellis was executed, and I was horrified, of course, when I heard this story, and it horrified me for many reasons. One of them, of course, is that an innocent man was very clearly executed. He is not the only innocent person who appears to have been executed. I found a lot of cases while researching this book where the evidence is pretty compelling. But at the same time, the fact that I had never heard of this case before, that I just, this journalist hearing, frankly, kind of an old war story from this one defense lawyer, I kind of got to thinking, well, how many stories are like this out there, where some defense lawyer, if you got the conversation going, would just say, oh yeah, I had a case like that in the 90s too, where an innocent person was executed. And I see James Weber is asking, couldn't the governor have intervened? Precisely, the governor could have intervened. And I failed to mention that, at this point, Ann Richards was the governor of Texas, and these same lawyers sent an application to her arguing for clemency, that the execution should be stopped. And she could have stopped the execution, but politically in Texas at the time, she was a Democrat in an increasingly conservative Republican state where support for the death penalty was assumed. And she almost had to prove over and above her Republican rivals that she was committed to this kind of tough, Texas style, harsh justice. You actually see a similar dynamic in other southern states. Bill Clinton was a sort of noted death penalty supporter, almost having to sort of out support the death penalty over and above his Republican rivals. So Eddie Ellis was executed, and it's a horrible, tragic story. And I went back and I read every kind of legal filing in the case, but I also looked at how the press covered this, right? I was wondering, did the press take this claim seriously? And the answer was no. There were journalists who covered the case for the Houston Chronicle, and they said that the defense lawyers had come into court with these, crazy last-minute claims, and that the prosecutors didn't believe them. And then a prosecutor said to a journalist at the time that Eddie Ellis, this innocent man or potentially innocent man, was a, quote, self-perpetuating crime machine. And the Houston Chronicle took that quote and they made it the headline of the article. So the headline of the article was about the execution of a, quote, self-perpetuating crime machine, right? Just, awful to think about, but really illustrative of the era. I mean, this is really what was happening in the 1990s. And my book is focused on Texas, but I really don't think that it's a Texas-specific story. I tried to write the book for a national audience and explain that this was going on in other states. Pennsylvania was sending many people to death row. Across the South, executions were happening all the time. And these cases of potentially innocent people ending up on death row were not uncommon. So fast forward 15 years, it's 2008. And Danalynn Recer, this lawyer, she had a kind of mid-career switch. So many of her colleagues burned out on being a defense lawyer. They just said, I can't handle the stress of this. I can't handle feeling like I'm playing some role in these executions of people who I don't think deserve it. And she decides that she's not going to quit being a defense lawyer, but she's going to change her tactics and she's going to move to a different part of the process. So instead of fighting the death sentences at the very end, at the 11th hour, right before the execution, she's going to go all the way back to the trial stage. And right after the crime is committed and the guy is arrested and goes to jail, she's going to get into the case at that point and try to convince the prosecutors not to seek the death penalty. Or if the prosecutor goes ahead and seeks the death penalty, she wants to go and argue in court and convince the jury, who ultimately has the decision in these cases, not to give her clients the death penalty. It was sort of like, I want to beat the death penalty at the front end of the system instead of the back end, right before the execution when really, everybody is jaded and unwilling to listen to these claims, right? So in 2008, she has this kind of signature professional achievement that I describe in the book towards the end. And she defended a man named Juan Quintero. And Juan Quintero, unlike Eddie Ellis, was definitely guilty of the crime. There was really no doubt about it. There were multiple eyewitnesses. And the crime that he committed was not to put crimes on kind of a scale of heinousness, but it was a crime that almost no one could, everyone basically agrees is an especially heinous crime, which was that he killed a police officer in Houston. The police officer was an undocumented immigrant. This was 2008. And the police officer went to arrest him because he was driving without a license and had been speeding, and failed to find a gun when patting him down. And Mr. Quintero shot through the the front driver's seat of the police car and killed this police officer. And like I said, he was an undocumented immigrant and had been arrested many times in the past for various crimes related to being undocumented. And Danalynn does sort of something very different than what she did in that 1993 case. Instead of looking through mildewy papers in, an old storage unit, she is getting every official record of this man's life that she can find. Every time he'd been to a hospital, every time he'd been arrested, every school he went to, all of his report cards. And then she started looking for everybody who'd ever known him. So she and her team interviewed literally hundreds of people who had known him. They got funding from the court to do this, and this is increasingly common in death penalty cases. He was from Mexico, so they were traveling around Mexico finding every cousin, every sibling. Even I remember she once said to me that the best witnesses are people who went to elementary school with him but weren't his personal friends. They just remember what he was like in the classroom or what his reputation was at school or what stories people would tell about him. And the point of all of these interviews was to kind of write a biography of him, but they didn't write a book about him. They just took all of this information and decided, what is it about this man, despite the horrible crime that he committed, that is going to spark mercy from jurors and convince jurors that he doesn't deserve to be executed for this crime. Now, the choices at this point in the legal process were the death penalty or life in prison without the possibility of parole. So he was going to go to prison forever, no matter what. And they wanted the jury to see all this evidence and think, maybe I still believe in the death penalty personally, but this particular man deserves just that little bit of mercy where he shouldn't, he shouldn't go to death row and be eventually executed for the crime. And they told the jury about a brain injury he suffered as a young man, which had really kind of set his life on a different course. He had been raised by an abusive father who had beaten him when he didn't get perfect scores on his math homework. He told one of his brothers said that he remembered this young man having nightmares where he felt like the numbers from math class were chasing him. I mean, just these sort of evocative details from this man's past. And that he had started to deal with his anxiety and his trauma and his abuse and his brain injury by drinking. And so he had become addicted to alcohol. And even in part of this, he had remained a very devout Catholic. He had committed his life to, going to church every Sunday. He was very close to the nuns who had raised him in schools. And he tried to make a better life for himself in America. He had gotten married to an American woman and built a life with her, and she had only good things to say about him. She had kids from a previous marriage who he helped raise. They only had good things to say about him. And all of this together was not about excusing the crime. It was not to say that, we proved that he's not guilty by reason of insanity, or that the brain injury caused the murder, or that this crime should be excused and that we as a society should not punish him for killing a police officer. It was just life in prison without parole is a better, more just outcome for this man in particular than the death penalty. And it worked. The jury, just enough members of the jury were convinced that he was not deserving of the ultimate punishment, and they sentenced him to life in prison. He remains in prison to this day. And Danalynn herself has become kind of a leading figure in her world of defense lawyers. She's not as famous as perhaps someone like Bryan Stevenson, who many of you may have heard of because he is the author of a book called Just Mercy, and which has been made into a movie. And Michael B. Jordan plays Bryan Stevenson in this movie. It's a great film if you haven't seen it. But everyone knows Bryan Stevenson, and I felt, well, Danalynn also sort of played a role in this history and has really helped change the way we think about crime and punishment in a very similar way to Bryan Stevenson. And my hope was that this book could sort of elevate her story in a way and use her story and sort of these cases like the ones I've described to kind of illuminate the hard issues at the center of these really difficult questions about what we do after a horrible crime has been committed, after the worst crimes really have been committed, a murder of a police officer, a murder of a child, the crimes that really make our stomachs churn and really force us to kind of question just sort of the harsh, evil reality of the world, right? What do we do with people who've committed these crimes? And 20, 30 years ago, the answer to that was often sentence these people to death row and execute them. And now there is increasingly a movement to say that we should be a more merciful society, and we believe in rehabilitation more. In addition, the book explores some other reasons for the death penalty's decline that have sort of nothing to do with mercy, and are more about just the kind of cold, hard finances and also the cold, hard practicalities of the system. So that case of Eddie Ellis, right, who was potentially innocent and executed back in 1993. His case, he was executed and no one really heard about him ever again. But there were a handful of cases in the late 90s where people were potentially innocent, and it did become a big deal. It did make the news, and it did spark a kind of debate about, is this person innocent, and can the system actually ensure that everybody who's getting sentenced to death really is guilty? There were some high-profile cases involving DNA where people who were on death row, DNA came along and exonerated them and proved that someone else had actually committed the crime. There's not DNA in every case, but increasingly that became a storyline that you would hear in the press. And then another storyline you would hear is that the death penalty was tremendously expensive. It costs hundreds of thousands of dollars more to sentence someone to death. I mean, I described this lawyer's investigation in Mexico where she interviewed hundreds of people. That's not cheap. And the courts have said that in death penalty cases, you have to have a higher level of sort of care and defense for people. And that costs money. And so the costs of these cases have sometimes bankrupted small counties. I've interviewed prosecutors who have said to me, frankly, I'll probably never seek the death penalty again. I still believe in the death penalty, but our taxpayer dollars are better put to use somewhere else. And it would break my county's budget to seek a death sentence against somebody. So I'm probably never going to do it again. So you have the money, you have the concerns about innocence and whether the court system gets it right. And then you have these kind of stories of mercy, like the ones I tell in the book. And all of them lead to the reality of the present where, increasingly when someone is facing execution, the sort of social response is not what it was 30 years ago. 30 years ago, it tended to be, just broadly speaking, you would hear a kind of unified voice of the public, whether in letters to the editor, in juries, in prosecutor elections, that this tough approach to crime works and is good, and it's what we want as a society. And now you increasingly see kind of a debate. Does this person really deserve the death penalty? In cases like Juan Quintero, who murdered a police officer, people are getting life sentences. Now people like Larry Krasner are being elected to DA of places like Philadelphia, which is a major American city. And Krasner has said that he'll never seek the death penalty. And now he's been followed by new district attorneys in San Francisco and in Los Angeles and in Austin, Texas, where I'm from, who also say we'll never seek the death penalty. And they're framing it really in terms of mercy, but also in terms of public policy, that this isn't a good use of taxpayer dollars, that if we could spend those dollars trying to prevent crime and prevent some of the sort of social ills that produce crime, whether it's poverty, a lack of education, a lack of opportunity, this is where our public dollars are better spent, rather than sort of picking off these one-off cases and symbolically saying we're going to execute this person to deter future crimes, right? I also want to say that, earlier this year, there was a run of executions carried out by the federal government, which have been historically fairly rare, and they were pursued by the Trump administration. These were all men who had been sentenced under previous presidents, under Bush and Obama and Clinton, and but they were all on death row, and their appeals had sort of run their course, and Obama had not been particularly interested in pursuing executions, but these men were all kind of vulnerable. And then Trump came along and said, we're going to execute these people. And there were 13 executions under Trump. And what I noticed, I had already finished writing this book by that time, but what I noticed was how for many of these executions, there was a focus in the popular press and comments I would read online and conversations I would have with people. There was a focus less on what the people did, though some that would often be discussed, than on what traumas of their past had maybe led them to the place where they committed the awful crime. The most extreme version of this was a woman named Lisa Montgomery, who committed a horrible murder. She murdered a pregnant woman and actually made off with the unborn child. It's an awful story. But what you heard about in the media was that story sort of balanced against or set against the story of Lisa Montgomery's own upbringing, which was just filled with the most awful kinds of sexual abuse and and violence and trauma that you can kind of imagine in a child's life. And she also was suffering from severe mental illness, from intellectual disability. All of this came out, I really saw what I felt was kind of a public debate about whether this woman really deserved the death penalty. And so I think the Trump executions kind of raised up what my book actually had been trying to raise up, which was the sort of public question of what do we want to do in the future, not just for the death penalty, but for the criminal justice system as a whole. Are we a country that believes only in harsh punishment and in kind of throwing the book at people and saying that, you know, the worst thing they've done should define them for the rest of their life and they should never have any role in our society ever again? Or do we want to have a system that is more interested in mercy and compassion and rehabilitation and, you know, not sentencing people to death so that they can live out their lives in prison and maybe help younger prisoners who come through and need sort of advice and mentoring from these older people who who did the worst thing one could do many years before? Or do we, want to like have a system that says, if you commit a theft, if you rob a store, then you should go to prison, but you shouldn't go to prison for 5 years or 10 years or 20 years. You should go to prison for, 3 years, and maybe you can kind of reorient your life and get get the tools that you were lacking on the outside world to re-enter life. And that's obviously a very kind of rosy view, and I'm kind of laying out two extraordinarily different views, knowing that most cases are on a spectrum, most people's views are on a spectrum. But because the death penalty is this one ultra harsh, public policy that we've had, and it's at the sort of pinnacle of the criminal justice system, sort of wider turn towards harsh punitive laws. The fact that it's disappearing, I kind of see in that lessons for our wider society as we kind of debate these issues, as we go to the polls and decide whether we want to elect someone like Larry Krasner. And now is kind of the moment. And so with that, I'll kind of open it up to questions. But thank you all for listening to all of that.
We're all coming back. Thank you so much, Maurice. Wow. Deep, deep stuff. Well, my first question for you is one that often comes up when we talk about the death penalty, which is, well, we need to deter crime, right? So that's why we have the death penalty. What does the data say? I mean, does the death penalty deter crime or not?
It's always been a very hard question. There has never been definitive data and analysis by researchers that has been kind of peer reviewed and vetted by a wider field that has said that the death penalty definitely deters people from committing murder. There have been some studies that have argued it, right? But they've been mostly discredited by other scholars. And it's a really hard thing to study because I've actually found an almost humorous quote in my research where a lawyer said, well, nobody calls up a researcher and says, well, I was going to commit murder, but I got deterred because I was worried about the death penalty, right?
True.
It's a tricky thing. But I will say that states that have had the death penalty, like Texas and Alabama and Georgia, have often had higher rates of crime than states that don't have the death penalty. Something I didn't mention earlier is that when we returned to the death penalty as a country, it wasn't uniform across the board. I mean, the federal government, as under Trump, will seek the death penalty in individual rare cases across the country, but it's mostly at the state level. And even more than that, it's at the county level. I mean, if I commit murder today in my house in Austin, Texas, I won't face the death penalty because the district attorney here has said he doesn't believe in it. But if I commit the murder 10 miles west of here in Hayes County, I might get the death penalty because the district attorney there does believe in it, right? So it gets county by county level, and many states that have had the death penalty have also had higher rates of crime, which has then led lawmakers to say, well, that's just proof that we need it. It's then led opponents of the death penalty to say, well, that's just proof that that it's failed, right, to deter crime. And so it ends up getting mired in these debates. And I realize that my answer to my question only made it more complicated, but that's sort of where we're at with that. There's no definitive proof that it deters crime, but it often, you kind of see what you want to see in the data.
Right.
I had a question for you. And thank you for that presentation. It's fascinating. As a doctor, I think about the so-called more humane ways of putting a person to death.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of not doing hanging, the idea of not using the chair, and using a more, quote, humane way with, sedatives and things like that. And then I read that it's more and more difficult to get the pharmacological needed medicines to do this more, quote, humane way of putting a person to death. And because of that, a state like South Carolina is thinking about reinstituting firing squads.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Would you like to comment about that?
Absolutely. This news came out last week that South Carolina legislature had voted to reinstitute the firing squad. There's discussions of doing it in a few other states too, in Missouri and in Nevada. And you mentioned a dynamic that I didn't mention in my presentation, but is very important, which is that one reason why there have been fewer executions overall is because states struggle to get the drugs to actually carry them out. They struggle because pharmaceutical companies, especially the big multinational pharmaceutical companies, have said that, basically, we don't want our products used for this. We are in the medical profession, which abides by the Hippocratic Oath, and killing people with our products is just flies in the face of what we stand for as companies. And activists who oppose the death penalty have kind of worked with these companies to institute distribution controls so that there's no way for the drugs to get to the prison systems. So the prisons have then turned towards other kinds of drugs. One state used fentanyl, which I found very kind of shocking, this drug that was responsible for so many opioid deaths. And states have gone to small kind of unregulated compounding pharmacies to get the drugs. But as you say, they have also talked about returning to other methods. And as that has happened, I've gone back and done a lot of reading. And of course, for the book research, I did a lot of reading about this. And we as a society turned towards these quote unquote more humane methods of execution in the 1980s because there was this idea that the old ways of the past were barbaric, right? That shooting people was barbaric, or that the electric chair was barbaric. And what I learned, I went kind of deep into this very kind of, frankly, macabre science. And it seems that actually the firing squad, ironically enough, if you were going to be executed tomorrow, you would probably choose the firing squad. And many men on death row have actually said, I want to be killed by the firing squad, because it is sort of more instant and there's less of an opportunity for things to go wrong. The drugs, once they enter your body, things can go haywire in all kinds of ways. I won't get into those sort of grisly details of that, but it can be very painful for people. And it's actually in some ways less humane than the firing squad, but the firing squad looks really bad. It's almost like a PR problem, right? And so I realized, in the 80s, they didn't care about how the prisoner felt. It's all about how we feel as a society looking in on this and watching it. We don't want to feel like we're a society that shoots people, frankly. We want to feel like we're a society that has this kind of calm, clinical, sterile, kind of safe environment that looks good, right? But this is also commensurate with the era in which they brought executions behind closed doors. I mean, if you go back 100 years, executions happened in public. People attended them, like sort of on the courthouse square and the difference between them and actually illegal lynchings was sometimes a little thin. But when they went behind closed doors, because there was this idea that it was more dignified, more sober. But I realized that it was actually about sort of avoiding scandal, avoiding how it's going to look to our European peers, right? When we go to the UN to be shooting people and electrocuting them in chairs. And now you're kind of seeing those tensions really come to the fore and really break down. And so going forward, you're going to continue to see states kind of grapple with, are we going to actually consider something like the firing squad? And then you have the prisoners who say, do it. We like this. This is what we want. But it forces us all to reckon with what we're actually doing. I think that that's really a key point. I'll say one other quick anecdote on that, which is that a story I tell in the book is about a Texas state legislator who in 1973 was trying to get his fellow legislators to not bring back the death penalty. He knew it was a losing battle. This was Texas. The death penalty was popular. He knew it wasn't going to work, but he said, I have an amendment to this bill. And my amendment is, every time there's an execution, we're going to bring the electric chair into the middle of the state legislative hall, and you're all going to sit there, and we're going to talk about the case, and you're going to have to vote directly to send that electricity towards that chair and kill that man. Everybody's really into passing the buck. Everyone's, likes to say, oh, it wasn't me, it's someone else. The prosecutors say, well, it's really the jury that makes the decision. And the jury says, well, he's going to get appeals. And the appellate judges say, well, the governor can step in at the last minute. And the governor says, well, all these judges and juries have looked at the case already. And this legislator wanted his fellow legislators then, but also I think all of us for posterity, and that's why I tell the story in the book, to look it in the face, to say, if you believe in the death penalty, you believe in the death penalty, but stop sort of pussyfooting around with these, making it more humane, putting it behind closed doors. Let's confront the reality of what it is that we're doing. And of course, his gambit with that, his sense is that when people confront it, they no longer have the stomach for it.
I have a question. So here in Philadelphia, the idea of the death penalty and bring pro-death penalty seems to be synonymous with victims' rights. So victim rights, victim family rights. And one of the big arguments against Krasner has been he's anti-victim. He does not listen to, to victims' rights and so forth, and which extends all the way to the death penalty. And I wondered if in a national scale, in your research about the death penalty, those who are pro-death penalty, do they frame it to garner public support in that way that this is standing up for victims and standing up for victims' families?
I have to hold back because we could spend a whole hour on just this question, right? It's a really interesting one. And in the 1990s, in the sort of heyday of the death penalty that I've been describing, a driving force of it was the victims' rights movement, which, going back in the 50s and 60s, the victims of crime really did not play much of a role in the court process. They often were kind of, the police would take their statements, here's what happened, but the prosecutors wouldn't really talk to them. And if the person went to prison, they would never be told if they were going to get out on parole. And you saw a kind of coming together of, feminists who were really concerned about, the experiences of victims of sexual assault. You had civil rights people worried about the experiences of victims of hate crimes, and just anybody who was a parent of a child who'd been murdered or a child of a parent who'd been murdered. They kind of found each other in this political movement and became very powerful. And a lot of district attorneys and mayors even would campaign with them basically on the stump and say, I delivered a death sentence for the man who killed, this family's loved one. And as a result, you should vote for me because I'm tough on crime and I deliver justice to victims, right? This was the line that you heard. In the book research, I came to realize that there was something going on behind the scenes there, which was that there were actually plenty of victim family members who didn't support the harshest possible punishment, who didn't actually want the death penalty. Maybe the loved one who was murdered didn't believe in the death penalty, and so they thought in that loved one's memory, this person should not be executed. Or maybe they just wanted the person to go to prison and that to be the end of it, and not to deal with years and years of appeals and uncertainty about whether the person would really be executed. Maybe they didn't want to go through the trauma of an entire big, headline news trial, right? Where they had to get on the stand and talk about this stuff. So you saw kind of a splitting of victims, and then you found that some of the victims who didn't support the death penalty would get mistreated, frankly, by the prosecutors and the police. They wouldn't get called for court dates. They wouldn't get the information. They wouldn't get the kind of explanations that the pro-death penalty victim families were getting. And they got mad about it, right? And they formed their own organizations. There's a group called Murder Victim Families for Reconciliation, and they really promote the idea of a model of criminal justice where it's not just about punishing the person, but it's about what was often kind of called sort of restorative justice, where we're going to restore what was wronged. And that can look like many things, but you see, a mediation where the victim family and the perpetrator meet, and the victim family can ask the perpetrator questions, right, that only they would know, right? I found a case in the book of a family, their loved one, their daughter, had been abducted and killed at a Walmart, and of course it was ultimately one man's fault for killing her, but also Walmart had been negligent in the way that it handled security in its parking lot, and this family wanted to bring them to court, to sue them in civil court, and they realized that by sort of talking, that really what they wanted was some accountability from Walmart, and that this one man could have been anybody, and it was sort of incidental. And so they ended up actually meeting with him, and he gave them information that they then used in their civil lawsuit against Walmart. And that's a kind of weird one-off story, but just I bring it up to say that kind of it can go in so many directions, right? If you're a family member of a victim if you're a family member of a victim of murder, or if you yourself are a victim of an assault, of a theft, no two victims are alike. They all want different things out of the justice system, and the justice system has traditionally had just one answer, which is harshest possible punishment. And if you didn't support that, then the prosecutors sort of didn't have time for you. And if you did support it, then the prosecutors were sort of happy to bring you along for the campaign events and kind of use you politically in their campaigning. And I think that's starting to change right now. You have more vocal victims groups saying, we don't support the harshest punishment. But I think in the Krasner election, you're seeing kind of both sides weaponize it to a certain extent. Right? I'm curious if anyone else has sort of thoughts on the Krasner election. Because I work in criminal justice, I don't live in Philadelphia, so I'm very curious to know what that election looks like for people who do live in Philadelphia, but don't necessarily spend all day thinking about criminal justice, right?
Am I the only Philadelphian?
Might be.
I'm in the suburbs, but I'm well aware of what's going on.
Sure.
Yeah.
And I mean, I would say that, like I said, it's strongly being framed as a, not tough, obviously not tough enough on crime. That Krasner's, it's because of Krasner's policies that we're having so much gun violence and where statistics show that since COVID, all cities are having these rising crime rates. And I mean, I think it goes back to what, Teresa's question about, the deterrent, is a deterrent. The argument is that, on the Krasner side, the argument is that, people who are interested in shooting somebody aren't thinking, okay, now am I going to get 5 years probation, or am I going to get 10 years?
Absolutely.
Or, it's like, Krasner's policies, in my personal opinion, and from the statistics I've read, are not causing the heightened levels of crime. But people are very passionate around these neighborhoods about, the rising crime levels and getting into all the neighborhoods. And there really is a lot of gun violence, more than there has ever been in Philadelphia. And, Krasner's the easy scapegoat for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, one thing I also realized researching this book is that, I was much younger at this era that was sort of the heyday of the death penalty. And I don't really remember this. And I had to kind of learn it through interviewing people, what it was like to live in a major city in America in the 70s and 80s when crime was much higher. If you were in Houston, New York City, Philadelphia, Chicago, I mean, people were terrified to walk down the street, and the death penalty, part of why it became so appealing to people was because because frankly, crime is hard to deal with as a public policy. It's a hard thing to reduce. There are really great ideas out there for how to reduce it. They tend to not be that cheap. But the things that cause crime are deep and systemic. They have to do with poverty and mental health and education and brain injuries even, that somebody who has a brain injury, whether it's from a bike accident or from, a rocket in Iraq when they were serving, is less likely to be able to regulate their emotions. And so they're maybe more likely to commit an assault, right? So crime comes from all of these difficult aspects of society that are hard to resolve, and the death penalty and prison sentences often felt sort of easy, or at least easy to understand, right? We don't have to get into mental health issues and brain injuries and poverty if we just say, well, this man made a choice and he committed this crime, and we're going to punish him and we're going to deter people by punishing him. And that model has been proven to not work. It did fail, and it left us with an extraordinarily bloated and expensive and wasteful prison system that also wastes not just money, but sort of human potential, that people who really could go into prison and come out 5 years later and get their life back together are being sentenced to 20, 30, 40 years, sort of really for no good public policy reason. And my hope with the book was that now that the temperature is a little lower, I mean, yes, COVID has led to certain increases in violent crime in some big cities, but still crimes are at a kind of generational low across the country. And so it's sort of a moment where there's more appetite for, oh, maybe a Larry Krasner can offer this new model and we can experiment with other ways of dealing with crime, because we're not all just so anxious and scared all the time and feel like crime is this out of control problem that we have to fix by any means necessary. So I think now is a real kind of test moment, and this election will be one of these kind of national flashpoints where if Krasner were to lose next week, it would lead the kind of criminal justice reform movement to kind of really reassess where it's at and figure out the future.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the time, as you said, the timing of COVID and is not going to help them at all.
Yeah. It's not, and the fact that there's been more gun violence, right? Since actually, rates of violent crime did decrease during the height of COVID, but then once things start to open up, and also crime tends to go up in the summer, it's some of these things are out of control, right? I mean, out of the control of a particular elected official. I mean, I was reading yesterday that there was this is going to be a funny example, but that there's a shortage of sauce at Chick-fil-A restaurants, and on Fox News they were blaming Joe Biden for that, and the extent to which Joe Biden is responsible for Chick-fil-A sauce is just laughable, right? But it highlights that, right? Like, if you're an elected official, you are not capable of fixing everything all of the time, right? And even in the limited view of criminal justice and crime and police, like, these are deep, difficult, intractable issues that can take a generation to kind of wind in one direction or another.
Maurice, I'm curious because I really don't know. Outside of the US, have other nations eliminated capital punishment, and how are we viewed by other countries in terms of not just capital punishment, but just our whole criminal justice system? How are we viewed?
Our criminal justice system is viewed as an international anomaly overall, in the sense that it is massive, right? That we have more than 2 million people in prison for our population. This is an incredibly high rate of incarceration, compared not just to the kind of Western European countries that it's popular to compare the US to, but really around the rest of the world. Now, that said, we don't know how many people are necessarily in prison in China or Russia or some of these more authoritarian governments, but Russia no longer has the death penalty, and really the countries that are left with the death penalty are us and Iran and China and Saudi Arabia and a whole host of kind of countries that are not associated with very positive human rights records. The one notable exception, for what it's worth, is Japan, which is also a democracy and also has the death penalty, and like here, it's also very popular. But I think what sets America apart from these countries is that in Saudi Arabia, I mean, I have not interviewed your average Russian or your average Saudi citizen, but the fact that they have the death penalty has less to do with what people there in the streets think and more to do with just what an authoritarian government says it's going to do. And it's almost like a part of their being authoritarian is, if you're an opponent of the government, we're going to execute you. We very tough on crime. And in America, and also in Japan, like I said, it's much more of a kind of a democratic public policy, that it's something like we voted in people who supported it. They enacted it for us. And then here we are. Many of us now don't support it anymore. But for, most of the last 40 years, more than 50% of Americans have said they support the death penalty. So in a way, these public officials can say, it doesn't matter what I think, I'm responding to what the people want. And they may be disingenuous, but it's a logical sort of train of thinking.
What's the relationship between, I believe in the United States, is liberal use of guns and ownership of guns versus the rest of the world and the death penalty?
It's a good question. I mean, they're kind of parallel in a way, in the sense that we have more guns really than any other country. These authoritarian countries I've been mentioning do not have the rates of gun ownership or gun violence that we have. In America, obviously, gun violence and gun ownership are sort of out of control compared to really any other country in the world, except for maybe some Latin American countries, most of which, is my understanding, don't have the death penalty. But I do think that for many Americans, the fact that so many people have guns means that you need other ways of deterring crime. And so the death penalty often gets raised up as a way to deter crime, even if it doesn't really work. I actually should have said earlier about why it doesn't work. Another point on that is that the number of people who actually get the death penalty out of all the people who commit murder is incredibly small, right? Like if you commit a murder tomorrow, you probably won't get the death penalty just because you're not part of the 1% of people who get it. And the sort of research and studies that have been done on it show that 1% really aren't the worst people. They're not necessarily the people who kill police officers or children or whatever kind of thing you think is the worst crime. They're just kind of random, right? They happen to live in Houston after a prosecutor election in which a tough prosecutor got elected, or there happened to be a lot of public outcry, or the county had enough money that year to send somebody to death row, right? They're these random cases. And so it's hard to deter when there's no like logical relationship between the punishment and the crime, right? Yeah, that's I guess what I would say about all of that. Another thing I'd say about guns is what I'm seeing is that even as the death penalty disappears, I think there's a lot of people who are wrestling, where they might say, when a pollster calls them on the phone and says, do you support the death penalty? They might say, no, I don't support it anymore. But then you get a mass shooting, then you get Dylan Roof, at the church in South Carolina, or you get the spa shootings in Atlanta a couple months ago, the grocery store shooting in Colorado. And in each of these cases, I think this is where people kind of really get tested. I mean, the prosecutor in the Georgia County where some of these spa shootings took place, she was like Krasner in that last year she campaigned for office saying, I will never seek the death penalty. And then this case happened. This young man killed multiple people at multiple spas in the Atlanta area. And last week, or this week, I believe, she announced she's seeking the death penalty against him. So she's, of course, advocates on the left who hate the death penalty say she's backtracking on her campaign promise, which she technically very much is. But you can see in her flip-flopping there that I think mass shootings and gun violence are where people are really on the fence about the future and whether they really want to commit to not having the death penalty anymore.
Really good stuff, Maurice. You are just a wealth of information. Holy cow.
Thank you. I hope it didn't overwhelm anyone. And I should say, if you have other questions and ever want to just kind of reach out, I'm always sort of emailing with people. So please feel free. I enjoy talking about these things. I find it very sort of intellectually enriching, and I feel very lucky that I get to spend all day thinking about this. Sometimes it can be very horrific and depressing to think about, but I find hope in the fact that we as a country have changed. I mean, there's been a shift here, and it shows that like things can change when people work at it. So I find a lot of hope in that.
What can we do to help you? I mean, one thing is we can buy your book. And I will post that again. It is a really good read. But what else can we do to help you, Maurice?
Well, I would say just keep up with, you can follow me on Twitter. You can keep up with the Marshall Project at the Marshall Project website. If you're ever inclined, the Marshall Project is a nonprofit that only thrives because of donors. Sometimes we get money from big foundations, but a lot of it's sort of small dollar donors. And you can become a member of the Marshall Project and get sort of perks from membership. And there's also a daily newsletter that we put out that's sort of everything you need to know about the criminal justice system. If that's too overwhelming, there's a once weekly newsletter that I kind of find more manageable. So just follow me there, donate to the Marshall Project, buy the book, and really just tell anyone you think might be interested in it, and kind of have these hard conversations, because I think that they can be really hard, difficult conversations to have, but I also think that people often come out of them thinking, wow, I've really wrestled with some deep stuff there, right? And there's something very empowering about that. So
I think probably the average bear has not really scratched the surface of the information that's out there,
Yeah.
unless they've personally been touched by it. It's only what we see on the news and what we hear
Right.
anecdotally. So,
Yeah, that's right. And one bad case or one really particular case can kind of shape how people think
Yep.
about these issues. And so my hope with the book was to really kind of zoom out a little bit and say, like, let's sort of look at it in a big systemic way.
yeah, well, I will certainly share our conversation with others who were interested in being here tonight but couldn't be with us. And certainly I will go to the Marshall Project. And I didn't know you could join. So I will join that. That's wonderful. And I want to thank everybody who joined us tonight. Rich conversation. I'm telling you, we are blessed to have the most amazing thought leaders join us and have these intimate conversations and Q&A. It's just such a blessing. In June, I will have Cecily Wilson join us. She wrote a book called She Said the P Word. And there's a funny story behind the title of her book that I have no doubt she'll share with us. Cecily Wilson is an award-winning broadcast journalist, motivational speaker. She had a stroke on air as a journalist and came back from that stroke, and then 10 years later had another stroke, and talks about just how one of the P words is perseverance, how she has persevered and come back again and again and again. She's lovely. It's an upbeat and inspirational conversation. So I hope I see you June 10th for Cecily Wilson. And then, I don't know, Jim, I tossed it out to you for July. What do you think? You want to come and do something for July, or do you want to do something later in the year?
If the book is out, which I hope it will be, that'd be fine.
All right.
We'll talk.
We'll see. We're up for grabs in July. Otherwise, I'm going to take a little break, and probably we're going to do some reformatting. I actually might move some of our programming to noontime. I think people are more inclined to Zoom during the workday at lunch than to Zoom in the evening. And then we're going to get back together in person. So Maurice, if you're in the Philly area, you got to come up to the Pyramid Club.
I'd love it. That sounds wonderful.
It's a beautiful place, 52nd floor of the Mellon Building, a short walk from the suburban station if you're not afraid to take a train.
Sounds great.
But it's wonderful, wonderful. And they have beautiful food, and you can get a glass of wine, and the view is magnificent. And the people who come to meet the author are just people you want to know.
Mm-hmm.
So good stuff. Anybody have any closing thoughts before we go off to the rest of our evening?
Thank you, Maurice, and thank you, Teresa.
Thank you, Elaine. Yeah, thank you all for having me. This has been a pleasure. And I hope to keep in touch.
All right, group
Great.
hug.
Thank you. Thank you, Teresa.
Thank
So
you
long.
for coming.
Okay. Good night.
We'll
Bye-bye.
see you next month. Take care.
Bye-bye.